Hello, and welcome to the John W. Kluge Center and to the Library of Congress. My name is Andrew Briner, and I'm excited to be here today for a conversation with Aynne Kokas, author of Trafficking Data, How China is Winning the Battle for Digital Sovereignty, a book that I've found fascinating, and it's been getting a lot of well-deserved attention. Trafficking Data gives a very thorough picture of what data trafficking is, the many ways it intersects with our lives, and what might be done to address it. Aynne Kokas is C.K. Yen Chair at the Miller Center, Director of the University of Virginia East Asia Center, and Associate Professor of Media Studies at the University of Virginia. Her previous book, Hollywood Made in China, looked at the growing links and partnerships between China and the US film industry that have shaped entertainment in the 21st century. Thanks for being here today, Aynne.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here, Andrew. And I am so grateful to be here among the Kluge Center faculty and scholars and the Congressional Research Service, Susan Lawrence, Caitlin Campbell, the Kluge Center staff, Travis Hensley, Michael Stratmon, John Haskell, you, my colleagues, Carla Freeman, Ken Pomerantz, here at the Kluge Center, and my research assistant, Emily Hamilton, who's here today. We're all really transformative for this experience, so I'm really grateful to be here.
That's great. Yeah, you were a Kluge Fellow here back in 2019, 2020.
Yeah, right in the middle of the pandemic, so
Yeah.
I had the full experience.
Yeah, exactly.
But it was really great to be here, and I'm so grateful to be back.
Yeah, thanks for coming back to talk about your book. Yeah, so in terms of format, I will be asking questions for about 45 minutes, and then we'll turn it over to audience questions, both virtual and in person, so think about what you're going to ask. And if you're watching virtually, you can put your questions into the Q&A in Zoom. If you're here, we'll pass a microphone around, and you'll raise your hand and I'll call on you. So I guess we'll get started. I'll ask, what sparked your interest in the topic of data trafficking and the relationship between the US and China?
So it starts with a very personal story, actually. When in 2009, I was a Fulbright scholar in Shanghai working on my first book, Hollywood Made in China. And I kept getting kicked off of the internet when I was trying to do research. And this was incredibly frustrating as a graduate student trying to finish my dissertation. And I was lucky enough to live across the street from a company that was a foreign-run proxy server, or a VPN company that helped people jump over the Great Firewall. And they also had really fast, really stable internet. So I ended up working on my first book at this proxy server company. And when I was there, I was working on this question of whether or not Netflix would be able to enter the Chinese market and what kind of issues they were facing. And Netflix was experiencing something different than Disney. They were having much more difficulty entering. And when I was talking with my friends and colleagues there, they were like, yeah, and it's not because of the content, it's because of the data that Netflix is gathering. And that's the concern that the Chinese government has. So when I was doing my postdoc, I actually worked with a cybersecurity lab at Rice University run by Dan Wallach, and kind of started to dig into that research and just found it fascinating. Initially, I was just going to look at the entertainment industry, and then as you see in the book, it expanded from things like social media and gaming to health data and agricultural data and the Internet of Things. So it's quite an expansive and explosive topic right now.
Yeah, that's something I love about the book, how you show how it comes into our lives in all these ways, in gaming and social media, obviously, very hot button issue. But to pull back a bit, What is data and why is it such a valuable resource right now?
So when we think about user data, we can think about the type of metadata that we're gathering about individuals, about their usage habits. We can think about the different things that people might add on social media platforms. But also, one of the things I talk about in the book is how we're able to wrap our heads around the idea of data by thinking of it as a metaphor in different ways. So a lot of the most popular ways to think about it are thinking about data as oil and something that we extract from people,
right.
Or that we extract from the world. And one of the things that I think is really important, and one of the reasons why I call the book Data Trafficking, is a lot of what we're looking at isn't just a resource to be extracted. It's our human existence. It's our lives. It's our connections to our families. It's our baby pictures. It's the things that we do in our private time when we're alone. And these are very personal, very intimate things. And I think if we talk about data as a form of as oil, then we're missing a huge part of this picture.
Yeah, and I think that connection to personal lives is what can get people very interested in this. You distinguish in the book between three levels of sort of data, the personal at one level, and how, I think what makes people interested is thinking about what is scary about my data sort of being spread around. But that isn't necessarily the most sort of dangerous thing about data trafficking to you. Is that right?
Yeah, no, and just to kind of by virtue of definition to think about like how I define data trafficking in
Yeah,
the
yeah.
book, it's basically the illicit but not necessarily illegal movement of data using commercial platforms for national political gain.
Mm-hmm.
And I look at this between China and the United States. Now, when we're thinking about this, it does feel uncomfortable to think about like us individuals being spied upon. But most people are not actually that interesting, and it does take some serious resources to be able to target and address certain individuals. And we
Right.
did have, for example, a case of concerns about TikTok spying on individual journalists. And
Right.
to be fair, TikTok is not the only tech company that has spied on individual journalists, but that is something that requires specific resources to be directed toward it. But there are also these issues of the development of dual use technologies through things like the development of synthetic media, using individuals, using their voices, using their videos, the development of powerful algorithms that can drive mis and disinformation. And then there's also an economic competitiveness element of it, economic security, where we think about outcompeting domestic US platforms and what that means in terms of control of the economic environment, the information environment. We've also seen TikTok try to move toward working with financial transactions. And if we look at WeChat as a template, there's a very clear interest to integrate a wide range of different types of technologies into one app.
Right.
So this I think is a multi-layered problem, and also with the rapid growth of companies in the tech sector like TikTok, it becomes very difficult to pull back once firms have become firmly entrenched into a specific ecosystem. And I'm thinking actually of something like Syngenta, which I bring up in chapter 4 of the book,
Right.
which is a precision agriculture company. And kind of even more than switching your favorite social media app, this is a company that is invested in 5% of the arable land in the United States and is heavily involved in how agriculture is done. That's really hard to switch out once it becomes very pervasive. And Syngenta is a company that is a subsidiary of ChemChina, a state-owned enterprise.
Wow. Yeah, and so you describe in the book data trafficking being a part of the rise of the U.S. tech industry before China even really comes into play, right? And then, so how did that develop, and how did things sort of change once China's tech industry entered the picture?
Yeah, so one of the things that I argue in the book is that actually the very permissive US tech regulatory landscape actually helps to support data trafficking by China, in the sense that there aren't necessarily very comprehensive data oversight regulations, digital privacy regulations in the United States. We've seen things like the California Consumer Privacy Act attempt to expand those. Individual states are acting in this way. And actually, this is really an interesting case of federalism, where we see states in some ways responding to these issues before we see the federal government responding.
Right.
And so without this permissive environment in the United States, it would be much more difficult for China to expand its digital landscape. And we actually see different policies for data gathering in the European Union and the United States for apps like TikTok, because there are different laws.
Yeah, what's different about the European regulatory structure that makes that not an issue?
Well,
Or
I
not
would
so
say,
much of an issue?
yeah, I would say that, and I feel comfortable with saying that my European colleagues would probably also agree that
Yeah.
by no means are the European laws perfect, and they do create some unwieldy bureaucratic concerns. But in Europe, we have things like there are things like the right to be forgotten, where
Right.
users can ask for their data to be removed from different apps. There are different types of digital protections for the type of data that users can gather, or that companies can gather about users. And these are things that we see occurring less in the United States because of the prioritization of the growth of the tech sector over the safety and security of individual users. And this isn't just related to China, this is related to the entire US tech sector.
Yeah. Yeah. So, what are the major differences in how the U.S. requires regulation of data collection versus how China does?
Well, I would say that might be more than we can actually. I would urge you to read the book.
Yeah. A broad overview. Yeah.
There are a lot of differences.
Yeah.
But in terms of some of the key differences that we can see, so is that first of all, there are national security data audits that the Chinese government requires of firms that are global firms that are operating in China, as well as Chinese firms that are operating globally,
Right.
which means that the Chinese government can essentially assess what type of data companies are gathering about users and shape their behavior, and actually constrain the type of data that companies are able to gather. At the same time, the Chinese government has much more expansive access to data from individual companies through things like military-civil fusion, which is a principle that requires companies to share their user data and other technologies with the Chinese government.
Mm-hmm.
But one thing that I think is always important to note, if we're trying to be balanced here, is that individual users in China actually have more protection from companies and corporate exploitation than they do in the United States.
Interesting.
I would say that they don't necessarily have more protection from government data gathering,
Right.
but they definitely have more protection from exploitative corporate data.
So individuals in the U.S. data can be shared pretty freely.
And also the type of data that can be gathered and
Yeah.
the flexibility of terms of services. So, for example, one thing that my students always find shocking, I teach a class called the Data Ethics of TikTok at the University of Virginia. And one of the things my students always find shocking is that TikTok can basically change the terms of their agreement kind of at will, like what data they gather when, and that's something that they sign up for when they are actually signing up for the app.
Yeah. Yeah, so going to TikTok, one of the fun things I'm sure about working in this field is things are changing constantly, and
yeah.
one thing in the news recently,
yeah,
exactly, adapting after this book that just came out.
I know, right?
So the University of Texas system just announced a ban on TikTok on devices using the university network.
Right.
What do you make of that and other bans in the U.S., local and state governments not permitting TikTok on government devices? We had this previous attempt to ban TikTok nationally, but now it seems to be very focused on these local university state level bans. What do you make of that?
Yeah, well, I think we are seeing movement to ban on federal devices as well.
Right.
But I think the state bans are really interesting because they're a little bit different in each state. And the state bans, in many cases, actually don't necessarily, they're kind of driven by state politics in many ways. And because of the pace of this legislation, hasn't always included necessarily all of the stakeholders who might be affected. So when we're thinking about devices for government employees, state government employees, that's something that has a lot of precedent and makes sense. There are government IT services, and it's possible to not to block certain apps from being downloaded or used on government devices.
Right.
And here at the library, I would imagine there are certain
we have government devices. We can't download most apps.
Right, exactly. So that from that standpoint seems pretty manageable. When we start getting to things like students not being able to use TikTok on university networks without a lot of advance notice and a lot of advanced preparation, this becomes a lot more difficult from an enforcement standpoint. As a faculty on a university campus, I can tell you that the first priority of our university police and our, and our university administration is not necessarily policing which network our students are using TikTok on.
Right.
We have, sexual assaults, we have shootings, we have students who are suffering from mental health crises coming out of the pandemic. This falls quite far down.
Sure.
Yet it's also something that's really hard to police and manage. And as students are going between their personal data and their Wi-Fi networks in the dorms.
Right.
In some ways, it's analogous to like the streaming issues, especially in the early 2000s, where
right.
There were lots of students who were streaming music and
illegal downloading,
yeah. Illegal downloads of movies, and basically, unless you were running like an illegal movie downloading company from your dorm room,
right,
probably would not get.
Universities look the other way. Yeah,
exactly.
But does this kind of ban, to you, does it have any grounding in, is it a sensible way to sort of try to address these data concerns?
Yeah, I mean, I think the government, state and local government device bans make a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm.
This is actually a kind of big issue as it relates to, especially for apps like TikTok, because we see that state and local governments are already deeply underfunded for things like cybersecurity and malware protection. And unlike the federal government, they don't have, the U.S. Cyber Command to turn to. They have overworked and overburdened IT staff who probably don't want to have to deal with this. Yet they have very fragile, often under-resourced infrastructure to manage. Right. So I totally see that as a precautionary perspective. The university bans get really tricky, especially when we're thinking about number one, in the case of TikTok, doing research on TikTok,
right,
as a platform, as something that's shaping social life. So, for example, there's a researcher named Dean Freeland, who's a professor at University of North Carolina, where there's a TikTok ban in place. And he's a state university researcher who does a lot of research on TikTok. So
right,
where does that fall?
Yeah.
And then there's also the question, some universities have also banned WeChat, which, after coming out of, for Chinese students for whom WeChat is a social lifeline home, coming out of the pandemic, coming out of, historically high anti-Asian racism and anti-Asian violence, the China Initiative through the Department of Justice, which targeted a lot of researchers and postdocs. This is a really big attack on the Chinese student community.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of different equities that need to be considered. And one of the reasons why I wanted to write the book was to articulate some of the challenges that we see, but also to look at how to balance these issues.
Yeah, and so something you talk about in the book related to that is sort of disentangling this concern with China's role in data trafficking and keeping that very separate from anti-Asian hate, anti-Chinese sentiment. How do you go about sort of disentangling those things and making sure that it's one and not the other?
Well, and I think this is an issue that anyone who is studying about China or doing research about China in the United States needs to take very seriously every day when they sit down to write or think about their work, because we can't write about these things without taking into account the complex domestic environment that we are part of. And so in the book, I use a concept that was developed by the anthropologist Pardis Madhavi, talking about women's rights in Iran as a scholar in the United States. So Iranian women's rights have been used, both has been used as a lightning rod for Orientalism and Islamophobia in the United States. Yet there are, as we've seen with recent protests, very serious issues that we see also occurring in Iran. And so one of the things that I try to do in the book is talk about very specific cases, specific companies, the laws that we see enacted by the Chinese government that affect how Chinese companies are operating, but also to make it very clear that whenever we talk about these issues, we need to be very specific and we need to talk about them in the context of US domestic politics. And that's one of the reasons why I'm so grateful that I was able to spend time here at the Kluge Center and the Library of Congress, to work with the team at the Congressional Research Service, to work with the scholars here, because I feel like I learned a lot about how to do that, and how to take those more nuanced approaches to these types of policymaking questions. And I really applaud the work that the Kluge Center and the Congressional Research Service is doing to help move that forward.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, and kind of related to that, how did the pandemic make concerns about data trafficking more sort of central to our lives?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't know about you, but I moved online a lot, and
Right.
I don't know that I've moved fully offline. And it's
Yeah.
kind of funny, when we were talking about this in advance, one of the first things I bring up in the book is the issues with Zoom, and how Zoom shut down June 4th commemoration events on Zoom, and how this presented an issue for that company, as well as what the US information environment looked like. And Andrew and I were talking about this on Zoom, during because we're so deeply entwined in this environment that it's
Right.
very difficult to actually, even being very critical, it's very difficult to also remove yourself from your ecosystem. And this is the same thing that I talked about with my students, in the data ethics of TikTok class, because we read the TikTok terms of service. We read them very carefully. They go through the whole thing. They're like, this is appalling. I can't believe that I use this service. I can't believe it's on my phone. And so one of the last tests that we have in the class is like, are you going to remove TikTok? And they're like, Professor, I still want friends. This is not. So yeah, I mean, these are terrible and my data is being exploited, but that I'm still going to use it. And that's one of the reasons why I think it is important for policymakers to really think about these issues, because it's a collective issue that's very difficult for individuals to resolve.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the Zoom thing brings something interesting up. We can talk about companies that are based in China to some degree, owned by Chinese companies. What about things like Zoom that are not primarily a Chinese company, right?
Right.
But what kind of sort of pressures do they face just from sort of doing business in the Chinese market?
Yeah, I mean, this is, for companies where being in China is an existential threat, or an existential part of their business, there are also really significant pressures to share data. And we've seen this, this is an evolution from earlier debates about intellectual property sharing. Now it's user data sharing, the development of different algorithms. We're seeing this, for example, with Tesla, which has historically made more money in China than in other markets.
Right.
And so, we saw Elon Musk weigh in on the Taiwan issue, which, there are these, I don't think that anyone really was particularly eager. I don't think that there were a lot of people who were like, well, I wonder what Elon Musk's perspective was on the Taiwan issue, but
Right.
he really went for it, and urged the finding of a constructive solution for both sides, in which we saw this kind of greater integration of Taiwan and mainland China. And so
it does seem like a necessity in some cases,
Yeah.
right? To get involved.
Yeah, absolutely. And from a financial standpoint, obviously that might be beneficial for Tesla, but this kind of activism, and also in the book, one of the things I talk about is Apple moving their iCloud servers to Chinese government-run servers, as under the Chinese 2017 cybersecurity law, they were required to do. So they're sharing all that data on Chinese government-run servers. But that would be like, well, I guess we'll see if Project Texas goes forward, because
Right.
if that happens, then we'll actually see TikTok storing their data on a U.S. server. It wouldn't necessarily be run by the Texas government, though. I guess that's
right.
that would be the key difference.
Yeah. Yeah. Related to that with TikTok, do you think that TikTok can credibly make a commitment to storing data in the US in a way that is not accessible to the Chinese government?
So so this is a so this is a hot issue right now,
Yeah.
and I know that there are a lot of people who are working really hard in the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States to come up with a potential solution here. And so I think that for me, there are a couple of different factors that I think about when looking at this. One is the pressure on a partner company like Oracle and their investments in China. So
Right.
that's one aspect of it. Another is looking at the fact that the TikTok algorithm, which relies on TikTok's data, is still required to receive Chinese government national security approval to be exported from China. So how that dynamic is going to happen, it's not clear to me.
Right.
And then finally, one of the things that really strikes me is how quickly the dynamic can change in terms of power and ownership between Chinese companies and their subsidiaries, as well as the challenging environment for Chinese companies right now. A couple of examples. We saw recently that for Alibaba and Tencent, the Chinese government took golden shares, which are special government shares for those tech firms. Now, in 2017, I was talking with the head of global public policy at Alibaba, and there had been a Wall Street Journal report that there were going to be golden shares taken of Alibaba. And when I brought it up to him, he said, absolutely, that will never happen. And then in 2022, we saw that it happened. And so there has been a shift. Similarly with Jack Ma, Jack Ma's disappearance after critiquing Chinese regulators in the fintech industry. So I think that there's a lot that we also don't know. And as apps like TikTok become more integral to US critical communication infrastructure, 25% of adults under the age of 30 get their news from TikTok. It's important to think about not just what's happening right now, but what are the implications in the near, long, and midterm?
Yeah, related to Jack Ma and Alibaba, how would you characterize the Chinese government's willingness to sort of sacrifice the growth or success of a company in order to make sure its other priorities are achieved?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, and this is actually interesting. I was talking with a person that I know who works in the Chinese government about this, and we happened to be talking about the TikTok issue, and I brought up that that perhaps if there was such a close relationship between a company like ByteDance and a U.S. tech, or if there was such a close relationship between a U.S. tech company and the U.S. government as there would be between ByteDance and the Chinese government, perhaps the Chinese government wouldn't allow that company to operate in China. And
Sure.
And he kind of agreed with that.
Yeah.
And so I think we're seeing a moment where the differences in the power dynamic between the U.S. and U.S. companies, the U.S. government and U.S. companies, and China and Chinese companies are really becoming very meaningful when doing business and engaging in trade between the two countries.
Yeah, but the U.S. doesn't really have companies that have that sort of relationship with the U.S. government, right?
Right. I mean, what we see is actually the U.S. has companies with entrepreneurs who are happy to expatriate to pay fewer taxes, and they're happy to pay the minimum amount of taxes that they can. They're happy to exploit user data of U.S. citizens in order to enhance their profitability. And these are hallmarks of the U.S. system. I don't even feel like I'm being critical, or that these would be things that those companies would be upset about hearing me say.
They would agree that that's accurate.
Yeah. Like, that's good business. We're minimizing our tax burden, enhancing our profitability, increasing shareholder value. And this is not how Chinese firms interact with the Chinese government.
There's an expectation that the firms are aligned with government interests to a large degree. So what are exactly the requirements of the Chinese government for firms in terms of data storage in China?
Yeah, so this is interesting. In the 2017 data security law, Chinese firms actually have to store their user data on Chinese government-run servers. So that doesn't necessarily mean that the government of Guizhou would be directly running it, but a state-owned enterprise in Guizhou province, for example, might be running the data service and data storage. Now, what this also does is facilitate things like civil-military fusion, or the use of data by the Chinese military. It facilitates things like national security data audits, and it allows for the Chinese government to actually have a lot of control and access of these kind of large-scale data projects.
Yeah. Yeah, and so to get into some more of the examples you talk about, you have a chapter on essential infrastructure and how that can be subject to data trafficking.
On critical infrastructure?
Critical infrastructure.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Yeah. So what are some examples of that?
Yeah, so one of the things that I personally found fascinating. So during the pandemic, I moved down to Charlottesville. So now I live in the country, and so one of the examples that I found fascinating was the precision agriculture example. And so precision agriculture is using very targeted data to drive the growth of agriculture with specific seeds. Oftentimes, farm vehicles are linked up to different apps and platforms in order to be able to identify when things need to be watered, how to best manage crops. And there's a company called Syngenta, which was a Swiss firm that was acquired by the Chinese state-owned enterprise ChemChina. And that is heavily involved in the agricultural ecosystem of the US. And when we think about things like that, farm data is not the first thing that comes to mind when we're thinking about data trafficking or about sensitive user data, but it's also really important for domestic stability, for for communities, for rural communities that are already in kind of rough economic straits, and so this becomes a really central issue when we're thinking about it. But I also looked at things like at broadband infrastructure in the book,
right.
At space and satellite infrastructure. So that's something I talk about in chapter 4, and also things like municipal management. And these are less sexy topics, right? So if you're talking about TikTok, you're talking about Fortnite, people are like, oh, tell me more. If you're like, let me tell you about this municipal management system, you've got a lot of people who are like, please, thank you, that's enough. but it's really important. And that's why I think looking at these state and local government bans becomes really significant.
Yeah. But though we can also talk about Fortnite.
Yeah. I mean, we should.
Yeah.
As a media studies professor, I do also like the fun topics. So that's one of the reasons why I got into it.
Yeah. How, like with Fortnite and Epic Games, how have questions of data storage, and ownership been big parts of their trajectory over the last few years?
Yeah. So one thing that I think is really interesting. So Tencent, one of the companies that I was mentioning that now has golden shares that are owned by the Chinese government, is also heavily invested in the US gaming industry, in things like Fortnite.
Right.
And one of the things that's really interesting in the Fortnite case is that there is a lot is that Epic Games is also a privately held company.
Right.
So this is where US corporate structure and the support that the US government has for relatively permissive growth by the tech sector becomes really important, because there's very little reporting that a company like Epic Games has to do officially to the US government about what their corporate operations are, because they're privately held.
Right.
And this is something that has protected legions of companies and their business operations, and also has supported the growth of the US economy in many different ways.
Sure.
But when we're talking about user data that includes things like mass social networks, people's voices, where people spend their time, their financial information, their psychological information about how they respond to conflict, things like that.
Yeah.
It's also a main, during the pandemic, apps like Fortnite also became really important sites for social engagement.
Mm-hmm.
This has new implications. And as someone who now teaches students in Gen Z, the way that they live their lives, especially post-pandemic, is really different than the way that I grew up. There's a lot more focus on being online and spending time with friends online and being part of networks. Than I was actually just talking with someone this morning about how, for us, someone my age, if I'm not on Fortnite or if I'm not on TikTok, sure, from a research standpoint, there might be things that I'm missing, but I'm not like socially excluded.
Right.
I still can have friends and it'll be fine.
Right.
But it's a very different situation.
Yeah, if this is your main social
Right,
sort of
yeah.
outlet and way to connect to people, that can
Yeah.
be very serious.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what kinds of uses are companies or potentially governments finding for data that they might get from Fortnite or another game?
Yeah, so we see. So I think that there are a couple of different areas. First of all, we see the mapping of communities and mapping of social relations, gathering financial information about users. We can also see things like understanding how how society, like psychological profiling about how societies function, and also in some military or in some gaming context, there's also developing kind of dual use technologies. So especially for more militaristic games, like developing more dual use technologies as it relates to potential weapons.
Yeah. So I want to make sure that we talk about some solutions and sort of paths forward. So you compare the issue of data trafficking to climate change in some ways.
Yeah.
Can you tell me about that comparison?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, one thing I wanted to add that I think
Please.
is important when we're thinking about the gaming and the gaming industry and the potential risks there is that Tencent, the company that had golden shares taken by the Chinese government, has also been heavily involved in something called AI intelligentization. That's a very clunky translation from Chinese, but basically the development of AI and for military purposes. So when we're talking about the potential dual uses in gaming and in the tech sector, it's not something that's highly abstract. There are already these relationships are in place, and Tencent is essentially a military contractor for things like artificial intelligence.
Right. That is an interesting combination. We don't see that as much with U.S. companies, right?
Well, actually,
maybe. Yeah.
I would say that's not as
okay.
unique.
Interesting.
It's just more commercially driven.
Gotcha.
Here, I think the golden shares would be much less likely. So.
I see.
Yeah. But thinking about the climate change issue, so this is one of the things that I think is really important to think about when we're looking at issues of data trafficking. So first of all, it's something that's a highly technical issue. It's also something that doesn't necessarily have a feeling of immediacy, and that's why I think the TikTok issue gets a lot of play, because it is something that people feel very immediately. It's like, is my device being spied on?
Right.
But actually, what I argue in the book is that this is a much more kind of comprehensive digital ecosystem issue. So some of the things I talk about are like the Internet of Things and devices in our homes. So for example, GE Appliances is owned by Haier, which is a Chinese consumer electronics company. And Haier has been heavily involved in developing connected devices and uses Baidu as a backend, the Chinese Google. So that's a type of integration that's, frankly, more difficult to explain to people.
And it's not really transparent for the consumers.
No, not at all, actually. Yeah. I actually did a lot of digging because I found out as I was writing the book that I actually had a connected GE appliance in my house. So I was really, really interested in what the outcome was. So I called everybody in consumer affairs and customer relations to find out, like, hey, where's my data being stored? Where can I find out this information? Right. Like what? And it was not forthcoming.
Yeah, and this is true for things like security cameras as well, you talk about. Right. Which, again, something that people might find fairly threatening or worrying.
Right, yeah, home security cameras, like the company Eufy. And actually with the Haier example, the only reason that I found out about this was because I was a congressional staffer liaison on a trip to Qingdao as part of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. And we weren't even planning to go to Haier, but the Qingdao team like added it on to our itinerary at the end. And then they were just talking about like how Haier is now a data company. And I was like, that is really interesting.
Yeah, I thought you made appliances.
That was not something I was thinking about. Yeah, but getting back to this climate issue, the thing that I think is really important here is it's a collective commons issue. And one of the things that we've seen in a U.S. context is this effort to really devolve all responsibility or not all responsibility, but a lot of responsibility to individuals, to companies, to self-police this, when there are a lot of disincentives, financial, social, personal, to not really comply with a lot of climate best practices.
Right.
But it's also something that's really hard to explain to constituents who are kind of like, this is inconvenient for me, and I don't really understand the science. I don't really want to, because if I do, that means I have to give up my really great car and my
Right.
great lifestyle.
Yeah.
And so there are a lot of similarities. But like climate, it's the sort of thing where if you don't address it at an early stage, the problem gets more and more complicated with each passing year.
Yeah, and thinking about it in terms of climate, I would find that kind of worrying, considering how unsuccessful our attempts to sort of take collective action to address climate change have been so far. Would you say that applies to data trafficking as well?
I would
kind of discouraging.
I would say that it has been somewhat discouraging. And one of the things that I think is really interesting is seeing actually people on both sides of the aisle in both houses of Congress expressing concern about these issues. The only thing that becomes tricky here is making sure to try to disentangle specific concerns about, for example, national security data audits, or golden shares, or Chinese Communist Party committees in specific tech firms, from broader antagonism between the United States and China, and to try to be as narrow and as focused on specific issues. The other way that I think we can address this is also just by protecting the data of US consumers and making tech companies more transparent in how they gather user data.
Right.
The problem is this runs into some barriers here in the US system, where there are a lot of people who are making a lot of money and generating a lot of shareholder value by not necessarily being very transparent. And just as an example, I was talking with some colleagues who live in LA and are working on a couple of different social platforms there. So involved in the video industry, and involved in streaming and short form video. And I was like, okay, so what do you think? So they were asking me, so what do you think about like my kids having TikTok? And I'm like, well, okay, think about the data that you gather about your users, and then think about if there was like government pressure to share that data, would you feel comfortable with your kids using it?
Right.
And they were like, well, obviously not. And I was like, well, what? Okay, so next step, would you feel comfortable having more oversight over what you're doing to protect everybody? And they were like, well, how would we make money?
Right.
And so these things kind of coexist, and they're very real, and they're a big challenge. And it's one of the reasons why I wrote the book, to try to emphasize and disentangle some of these challenges.
Yeah, it's a really interesting problem where so much of the issue is an unwillingness to protect U.S. consumers from U.S. companies that then radiates out into this international issue, right?
Right. And I would say it's, to be fair, I think that there are a lot of people who are very interested in protecting U.S. consumers in, all branches of government. I don't think that doesn't exist. I think that structurally there are a lot of headwinds against it.
A lot of interest pushing in the other direction.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And so you talk about data stabilization as sort of a primary method of dealing with this, which I took to mean sort of a lot of small, you describe them as wedges, a lot of small steps that can add up towards stabilizing this issue.
Yeah, so kind of like the climate issue, and I rely on that heavily in the conclusion of the book, where I talk about this idea of data stabilization. So there are these scholars called Pacalo and Sokolow who came up with this famous concept, climate wedges, where basically the idea is that it's very difficult to make large systemic changes, but there are a lot of technologies that are available right now that we could use to help protect the climate. And so it's one of the incremental strategies that has had some effect, though it was also criticized for being too conservative. So to be fair, but I look at different data stabilization wedges, like enhanced requirements for reporting by the Securities and Exchange Commission about how data is stored and used and distributed, different acquisitions, I also talk about the importance of working with allies and partners. And this is actually a much more complicated issue than just saying, let's work with our allies and partners,
Right.
because frankly, our allies and partners don't really have similar approaches to this, largely because of the exploitative US data environment. So the European Union developed the General Data Protection Regulations in response to the US as much as, if not more than, in response to China. Our allies and partners in places like Australia and Japan and Korea are still trying to navigate their security and economic interests in the United States, and also their security and also their economic interests in China. And so
Right.
it's very difficult to kind of come to common ground here, but I think that's really, really important.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think we will turn it over to some audience questions now. Sure. Sophia has a microphone here.
Could you enumerate some of the obnoxious or undesirable terms of service that we haven't read? Because I never read those things.
Yeah.
And I don't think very many people do.
Oh my gosh. I mean, there are so many. And to be fair, a lot of these are actually common across a wide range, across terms of service from US-based firms and Chinese firms. But this is also part of the problem, having this very permissive environment and then different pressures on firms. So some of the things that I find particularly appalling are ownership of any IP that you post. So your photos, let's say that you're, a famous photographer and or a famous videographer and you're putting up your videos, like that can be used however you want it. I had to sign a media disclosure form, very carefully for this one event here at the Kluge Center to see how my media could be used. Anything that you post can be used however TikTok or a lot of other platforms want to use it. The idea that the terms of service, so signing the terms of service means that you agree that the terms of service can change at any time and you will agree to those future terms of service. So you're basically kind of signing up for a mafia family at that point. You're like, I will always just follow the rules, whatever they happen to be in this context.
Well, and I think in the book you talk about sort of connected smart devices being especially problematic because you are agreeing to those terms of service just by using the device, right? You don't even have to click something.
Yeah, so your refrigerator, I mean, how many of you have signed a terms of service for your connected refrigerator or for your security camera that you know of or that you read or paid attention to? How many of you know who owns the company, like who is the country where the firm is domiciled? Like, I mean, a lot of you may have a Eufy RoboVac or a baby monitor, and those are all things that people don't care. They just want to get a good price and get it set up quickly. And one of the things I argue in the book is like people who need a RoboVac are not people who also have time to sit down and pore over terms of service. You're just trying to do the basics of life.
Right. And thinking about privacy as it relates to a RoboVac, like most people would not really connect those two things, right?
Right. And this becomes a really interesting part of the book where a lot of devices are developing increased functionality, with additional downloads, with firmware updates that we don't even really know or pay attention to, and there may be kind of concerns about those updates that you have to constantly pay attention to. That's why it's so important to really set up the terms very clearly about what data gathering devices you allow into your home, into your life, and it would be really great to have consumer protections that don't require individuals to pore over the terms of service for an entire length of a university semester in order to be able to fully understand them.
That would be nice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are they using the data for corrective behavior? Whereas if they're embracing capitalism, is it where are they drawing the line for materialism as okay, and whereas it would be socialism or communism as an ideal? So where is there evidence that they are using data to maybe design corrective programming?
Yeah, so this is, are you talking about TikTok in particular, or? Yeah, so I think again, this is a case where it's really important to think about the specifics of individual cases and what the implications are there. So if we're looking at the case of TikTok, for example, one thing that we've seen is, first of all, there's, the TikTok algorithm is a black box and has also been protected by national security export regulations by the Chinese government. And we see that the For You page is able to kind of feed information to users in a way that's very not transparent. And we've also seen reports of the downplaying or suppression of certain types of information related to things like Hong Kong or Xinjiang or Taiwan. Now, one of the challenges, and this is kind of at the crux of the argument of the book, is that there are these same protections for companies like YouTube and companies like Facebook. But there are different kind of political equities that YouTube and Facebook have, and different political relationships that they have with their parent companies and with the US government. And so this is where things become really, really complicated. Do we just acknowledge or allow that to be part of the US tech ecosystem and have however that happens, however it plays out, that's just how it plays out? Or do we try to enhance transparency for all users across platforms? Because there's also the concern that the Chinese government, for example, has purchased ads on places like Facebook to help guide opinion and to spread mis and disinformation. So it's not that US platforms are completely unaffected by this.
Thanks, a lot. It was a fascinating talk. Are you and your family on TikTok? That was one question I had.
Yeah, no, thank you for asking. So actually, this is a question I get a lot, and one of my next projects that I'm really excited about is to try to write a kids book and a manga, like a comic book about data security and privacy, because I think that this is the sort of thing that actually talking with my friends' kids. So I don't have kids, so fortunately, I do not have to deal with this, and I more power to everyone who has to. You're fighting the good fight. But actually, kids, even as young as 6 or 7, understand the type of data that they're sharing with video games, for example. You just have to ask a few questions. So I have TikTok on a research phone, that I use as a separate device, and so I access it, but it's not on my personal device, just because I don't feel comfortable with the terms of service. I've read them too much, and so I think this is a really, really challenging issue that people face in terms of their social lives, and I wouldn't judge someone else for being on it. And we see this weird dynamic happening where President Biden was briefing TikTokers on his policies as CFIUS was investigating and trying to work on this Project Texas negotiation. So, I'm hardly the only one, or families are hardly the only one who are trying to navigate this complicated landscape.
Actually, that was just like a short.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about what the companies like TikTok are doing in response to what the U.S. is doing?
Yeah.
Do they just blindly do whatever the Chinese government tells them to do, or are they within China trying to say, we need some separation here in order to deal with the U.S.? Not to be too sympathetic towards TikTok or any of these Chinese companies, but one could imagine that they just want to make money and they're being pulled in two different directions. I just was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Oh, yeah. No, and actually, this is actually something for which I would also really urge you to read the book, because this is a really complicated, really interesting story. But just to kind of give you a little overview. So on one hand, we've seen TikTok increase their lobbying funding from hundreds of thousands in 2019 to millions in 2022. So that's an important difference that we see. Also hiring the Biden campaign's press secretary, for their public policy shop, Jamal Brown. So that's an important, so they're really working within this U.S. ecosystem. We're also seeing that, so TikTok very, reasonably is making the argument that A lot of their moderation practices are just as transparent as other U.S. tech firms. They just have a kind of more complicated relationship with their founding company. But they also are incorporated in the Cayman Islands and have a board that includes people like Bill Ford, a paragon of American industry. So again, kind of working in this model. And even though they have a reporting relationship to ByteDance, and in the terms of service, it says that they can share their data with their parent company or other subsidiaries, they work very hard to distance themselves from that relationship. But still, the algorithm can't be exported without Chinese government approval. So there's a lot of work that's being done by TikTok to establish itself within the framework of a U.S. firm. The headquarters moved to Singapore. A lot of the data storage was moved to Singapore and the United States. So they have definitely been responding, and I think it is a better system for U.S. consumers now than it was 3 years ago. The question is, will it ever get to the point where there's a kind of stable and secure long-term advantage or circumstance? I think we see something.
I feel sort of ridiculous asking this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway, in the spirit of feeling free to ask ridiculous questions. Every once in a while on Facebook, you see what I always have assumed is some kind of scam about, I do not give Facebook permission to use my data, and you're supposed to post that, and then that's going to make everything magically better. And I've always assumed that that means nothing, but you'd be the person to ask.
Well, so first of all, I'm a huge fan of asking the questions that you want to know the answer to. And I think so. I appreciate that very, very much. And I think that this is really indicative of the challenge that users face when dealing with a lot of these issues. So there's this devolution of responsibility to individual users to basically use the tools that they're given by the platform, in this case posting or privacy settings, in order to protect themselves from data exploitation by that platform. But when we think about it from a systematic standpoint, so you're using the tools of the platform to protect yourself from the platform. The deck is it's kind of like Vegas. You're kind of there. You only the choices that you have are really determined by a company that does not have any interest in actually protecting you from data exploitation. So I don't. I haven't researched that specific issue, but so I don't think that would be the way to go. I would actually move toward trying to limit usage as much as possible, or even better, advocating with your state, local, and federal leaders to try to implement some more data protections for users. Thank you for your question.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we have time for, yeah.
Thank you very much for interesting dialogue. I'm curious about your thoughts on U.S. Leadership on international efforts with the United States ally, like Australia, Japan, EU, are furthering their cooperation in data policy and data governance. Is there any possibility that United States is maybe like lagging behind international cooperation efforts? Or would you see that United States will be the place where countries can try out their business models without any restrictions? Yeah, I would like to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for that great question. So I had the opportunity to spend this past summer in Tokyo as an Abe Fellow at Waseda University. And there I had the opportunity to talk with friends and colleagues in the Japanese government about their challenges as it relates to data trafficking. And actually the book will be coming out in Japanese from Nikkei Press, hopefully this coming year. So hopefully it will be available to readers in Japanese language soon. But one of the things that we talked about was first of all, the fact that in Japan there's a different type of relationship between technocrats. So there's a higher priority placed on people from the tech sector moving into government. In many ways, being a civil servant is a more desirable career path in Japan than in the United States. We also see an environment where countries like Japan are really in a big in Australia and Korea are in a really challenging position where they're part of this Indo-Pacific region. They have very close proximal geographic ties with China, a lot of trade engagement with China, and so it's difficult to kind of take a very hard line, to take the same hard line that the U.S. might take in their interactions with China because of those relationships. The other thing that we talked about, and I alluded to earlier in my comments about the EU and the United States, is that the U.S. still needs to rebuild a lot of trust with countries like Japan and Korea and Australia and regions like the European Union because of data exploit in India, because of data exploitation that U.S. tech platforms have engaged in these countries, and where there are data privacy laws that are in part a response to the U.S. tech sector. So working together with allies and partners requires trying to come together on that. And yeah, absolutely, I learned a huge amount when I spent time in Japan, also from Korean regulations, from Australian regulations, from EU regulations. And I think that there is a lot to learn. The big challenge is, and as we've discussed today, is that we're really seeing the headwinds of the prioritization of the economic growth of the U.S. tech sector make it difficult to make policy in the U.S. that protects consumers in that way. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, so I think that's all we have time for today. Thank you so much to Anne. Thanks to all of you for being here and those of you watching online. If you are watching online, you'll be asked to fill out a survey right after closing this event, which we would greatly appreciate. If you're here in person, you'll have a paper survey that we would also really love for you to fill out. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, everyone.